Hello, welcome back to another video of Doom Optimism.
Welcome to Doomer Optimism. That was my son, who's quickly becoming a YouTube star by making appearances on this podcast. Welcome. Today, who are we talking to, Cleo? Do you know her name?
And
Farron, yeah,
Morgan.
that's right. We're talking to Farron Morgan. How you doing, Farron?
Good. How are y'all doing?
We're doing fine. Yeah, looking forward to spring. It definitely cheers the soul
Yes.
to start getting warm days again.
Yeah.
Yeah, how are you feeling about this winter and spring coming and all that?
I'm feeling good. I think I really love the sort of like divine intentionality behind the seasons. I think like we get to the end of winter and are just completely spiritually depleted.
Yeah,
And then you have seed time, which is like the most
exactly.
optimistic thing that could possibly
Yeah.
exist.
No, after I think at the end of every season, you're kind of tired of that season and you're looking for the next one, and it kind
Yeah.
of makes sense. Yeah, it's nice. Well, I guess I'll tell the audience that if they don't know you, they're a really bad audience because you've been on at least a couple times on this podcast.
Yeah.
One of our favorite guests, and I think last time we talked to you, you had been reporting about lithium mining in a North Carolina community.
Yeah.
Quickly, is there any updates on that? Do you want to update us on any of that?
I think the most significant update is that with the change of administration, that's pretty much been put on hold.
Oh,
A
interesting.
big part of that is because of the policy favoring electric vehicles
Yeah.
has changed under this administration.
Okay.
Benefits that were available to companies like Piedmont Lithium, the company in that story, have been put on hold, I'll say. And this is something that I think is just interesting about these development projects, period, is that we're in this space where, policy can change drastically. It can reverse itself in 4 years. And so, this notion, especially for small towns that are sort of like accused of being not in my backyard about this. Well, if you're not in my backyard about something that could be built, I mean, in that case, there were homes purchased, properties purchased, homes burnt down in preparation for the
Mm.
dig, and now it's just on hold. So,
That that's
yeah.
wild. Okay. So the
Yeah.
community is pretty happy about that for the most
The
part.
community is really happy, but they're also I mean, they remain very suspicious of the company. So the way that they feel is like, well, they have all of this time to prepare and to sort of, double down for potential future change in policy. And so they're really sort of like wary, even though it's on pause of where it might be going in the future. It's interesting.
The policy environment can change quickly. At least they have time to kind of get their ducks in a row, get
Yeah.
their legal advice kind of sorted out, stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of I know you've been looking at lithium mining in multiple places, right? So I guess that's a
Yeah.
similar story elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's interesting to me because it's kind of the energy story is that we're having these like serious partisan policy fights about, energy usage, energy development, energy growth, what the appropriate sort of approach to energy is, whether it's this kind of like fossil fuels uber alles, whether it should be an absolute pivot to renewables. But I mean, that's the story to me, I think, at this point is just how much it can change and how much infrastructure planning, things that, we traditionally think, okay, well, this project will take 10 years. This project, I mean, it could take 20 years. Like these are massive, massive projects. And they just sort of like, turn on a dime. And so I think there's a question there in terms of resource use. But again, for the public, there's a question about, okay, well, if any of this stuff goes in our community, is it going to be abandoned? Is the project going to be half completed and then abandoned? Like what happens with these projects that sort of are affected by the political powers that be and kind of changing political lands?
Yeah. Okay. And so that was, I don't know, like a year ago that we had that or maybe 2 years ago. I can't remember at this point. The time Yeah. So what have you been up to since? And it doesn't just have to be professional kind of storytelling. It could be just anything interesting that you want to talk about in your life
Yeah,
or
a
yeah,
lot.
what went on?
Yeah, a lot of it is that. I mean, a lot of my writing has been, at least recently, for County Highway specifically. The last two stories that I've put together have really been sort of like music focused, which has been very nice for me.
Yeah.
Just because I think like there's so politics is all consuming right now, and to the point that it's like I think reached a complete saturation point. Like this morning, I like logged on to Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it now.
Intolerable right now.
Yeah, I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And it, so much of it seems frankly designed to disinspirit. And I think in a way, the best thing that we can do is to focus on the beautiful things that humans make and the ways that humans are still making them.
Yeah, yeah,
Because otherwise, I feel like we're in this like boxing match where it's like, yes, technology, no technology, and none of it is human. Responding and being obsessive about technology in sort of a equal opposite way is also really corrosive, I think. I think
yeah,
like we just need to think more about, truth and beauty. And
yeah,
so it's been really fun and nice just to talk to creative people and to hear sort of how their human experiences make their way into art, how they think about the creative process, all of those sorts of things. So
yeah.
that's been really fulfilling, I think.
That's good. Yeah, I got the sense when we talked last that, I mean, just constantly covering, like, being the resistance and constantly covering these just really depressive things, it does have a toll on your soul.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then that doesn't really benefit. Like, if your soul is just completely barraged with like doomerism, then you just can't bring any joy into the world.
Yeah, exactly. And just experience joy for myself. I think I'm going to be for this year and I'm thinking a lot more about how I want to live the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And I don't want to live it upset all the time. And I definitely don't want to live it in sort of that churn of like, okay, well, maybe I'm making a difference. Maybe I'm not making any difference at all, but I'm making money.
Yeah.
That can't be what it is. I think there's enough of that in media. And I really do think that like, there's a kind of communion just in the relationships that we have with each other and in creating. And I think, I'm sure I've said this before because I feel like I talk about it constantly, but I believe that we're God created and created in God's image. And I think that that's something, I think creation is something that we have to do. It's like part of our natural inborn law. And so I think this thing where it's just like, well, yeah, a big part of what's happening in sort of tech period is that we've like created a situation where we essentially already created the conditions for a replacement. So, by making things flatter and making things less interesting, not sort of like reporting about what's human, not sort of providing any color, not going places. And we're like, okay, well, I can send an email. Well, an AI agent can send an email,
Right.
to that extent of creation, like we're not creating, we're just sort of like pushing
Right.
words on a laptop. So
Right. If you act more like a machine, you'll be replaced by a machine.
yeah,
So don't act
exactly.
more like a machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
That's
who we
So
can
yeah,
become a
those are the
machine?
things.
He's worried that our cat's gonna become a machine. Our cats, yeah. I don't think that's gonna happen, at least not yet. We're
Good
not we're
premise
not
for a
going we're not getting any robot cats anytime soon. Um,
Or what if we do get a Robux?
well, I'm not gonna pay for it. You can choose that. So what's bringing you kind of the most kind of creative joy right now? Either something that you're doing or something that you're reporting on or storytelling about?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of working on this story about the American College of the Building Arts. Are you familiar with that at all?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so it's
Something I
this.
should know about, I take it.
You should. I think you would
Yeah.
love it. So it's this school. It's a 4-year liberal arts building arts
Mhm.
joint program.
Okay.
And they offer stone carving, wood carving. They have a like architectural design program. They have like a certain set of tracks that you can sort of follow. And then they have these liberal arts classes that kind of back up those trades programs. So if you're learning about architectural design, you're also learning about sort of the philosophy of design, about, philosophy of place, ideas about beauty, drafting, that like all of these different sort of like theoretical things. And then also the sort of very practical education that deals with like just working in the trades. Like you're going to be working with other contractors, you're going to be working with clients. What does your timeline look like, etc. But these interviews with these folks, I think everybody like teachers, students, everybody in between, they all just had these like wonderful, beautiful, inspiring things to say. Um, and I've just been going, sort of transcribing my interviews now. And I feel like every single one of them, I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to go back there.
Yeah.
But, it's unique in the sense that it's sort of I wouldn't say it exists completely outside of sort of these technological debates, but in a way it does. I mean, there's some of them are using and adopting AI tools on the periphery, but when it comes to the work, it's sort of very, physical, hands-on work. And, one thing to me that I keep thinking about, I talked to this girl, Bree, who's one of the blacksmithing students, and we were talking about like injuries because
Yeah.
obviously smithing, there's like a ton of
Yeah.
burns and cuts and things can go wrong and they can go catastrophically wrong. But sort of just that physical relationship with space, physical relationship with beautiful objects, and also this kind of like, endless tradition of craftsmanship in the trades and thinking about like when you go into a building, you're not just in the space, you're sort of part of the space. Like you should be looking at things, you should be thinking about things. And I think we're so like, again, technology really draws you down, and into yourself. But that kind of thought and that kind of making, um, I think draws your attention up. And
Yeah.
I feel like blessed. The time that I spent down there was so renewing, I thought.
Yeah. And so I'm very curious now, like where is it located and how long has it been going on?
It's in Charleston and it started, I think in the early 90s, they had this really catastrophic hurricane
Yeah.
and it destroyed a lot of the, Charleston's a, gorgeous city with all this like wild,
Yeah.
architecture from the 1800s.
Yeah.
And, a lot of that stuff was destroyed, like, homes, public buildings, etcetera. And what they found is that they had no trained craftsmen to, rebuild, essentially. And so, they started and it's been sort of like an ongoing problem. It's a problem in DC when it comes to, like, the architect of the Capitol, like, all of these gorgeous historic buildings in DC. We're talking a lot about, like, the trades in terms of electrician shortage or plumbing shortage or whatever, but there's also a shortage of people who are able to do, like, artisanal stonework or people who, are able to hand make furniture or, all of these things that we do have a tradition of doing and a tradition that pre-exists the United States, obviously. I mean, in some cases, blacksmithing obviously is like something that people have been doing since the Middle Ages and still exists. So that work still exists in those places. So the thought was kind of, okay, well, how do we start to sort of foment that workforce?
Yeah.
So I think seeds were planted then. I think really in its current iteration, it was like 2000, that it kind of became, what it is now.
Okay, that's wild. That I haven't heard about it. It makes me think about, so one of my dream kind of trajectories is I want to start like a field school with like natural building and agroecology and various kind of traditional crafts and things. So I'll definitely have to check it out because it's
Yeah.
aligned with one of my dreams.
I have some other folks I'll have to contact you with
Yeah.
or connect you with rather. There are a couple of brothers who live down here by me, but
Okay.
they have their own homestead and they do everything, like everything. And that I know their family really well. They come from a family of folks who have been in the building trades for a few generations. No, but they're like my family, they cook molasses and syrup and make apple butter, and I think last time that I talked to them, they were trying to make peach butter, but you would love them. I think you would really dig them.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Awesome. Well, Kaleo, I know where you're going to go to college. So what's the plan for you?
Another thing that's really and I will stop, like, making this all about the school, but it's really fascinating. It's really beautiful. They have is this library of texts that belong to Thomas Jefferson that have all to do with like architecture and like, you
Nice.
know, European architecture, theories of architecture for the then new world. And that's really, it's not sort of like kept under lock and key. If students want to come in and look at a book, they can come in and look at a book. And I found that to be really beautiful. I feel like that's what books, they're not sort of meant to be these rarefied collector's items. They're meant to be used. And I think Thomas Jefferson would be psyched that they're being used in that way. Like
I mean, they're
just
not just. I don't think he'd want them to be in a museum while the country goes to hell.
yeah, exactly.
To me,
Exactly. You'd be like, please use these.
again, yeah.
Why can't we
That's awesome.
have Thomas Jefferson as a president again? Donald.
Yeah. Okay. So, wow. I mean, it would be nice just to kind of dwell on this kind of stuff, but presumably the pretext for this conversation, although we don't need a pretext, but the pretext was this: you went to San Francisco. I mean, that's kind of wild. You went to San Francisco to interview people from the kind of anti-AI extinction movement. I mean, so these people are kind of like pretty radical and pretty freaked out. Uh, well, first of all, what led you to be interested in that and want to go talk to them?
Yeah, it's something that I've been chatting with my editor, Olivia, about a lot is just these sort of like different strains of anti AI, protest groups. And really the thing that we've been talking about is, and I mentioned this in the story a little bit, like this sort of like AI safety space and even the AI resistance happens in either in the tech world inside these companies where folks are working on these problems in a practical way as part of the models that they're developing. How do we make these safe for use?
Yeah.
And then also, obviously, in sort of like the academic realm, computer scientists, and frankly, philosophers and theorists. Frankly, that is a mess. Like they all seem to agree and then disagree. And they have these, to me, kind of like petty, well, I think this and you said that, and that could be very dangerous. And to me, I think it can be a little bit like, frankly, inside baseball. Not that it's not important, but it's just that if it only happens in that field, it never spills over.
Yeah.
I think this event, essentially Jeffrey Hinton resigning, one of the godfathers of AI, who was working at Google, his resignation from Google in 2023, I think is the point at which a lot of this stuff started to spill over into, the public realm a little bit more. And I think, since then, a number of protest groups have emerged, but they all remain relatively small. And, in the meantime, so I would put those groups in the sort of like AI on the extinction basis or on, the proposition that it could lead to some kind of extinction. But in the meantime, there are all these other groups that have popped up that are either working on, sort of AI as a threat to jobs, as a threat to sort of like, the middle class and economic viability. AI is an environmental issue. AI is a child state safety issue. And, I would say even at this point, those groups are still pretty like they still all kind of stick to their own lane.
Yeah. And they kind of have different political affiliations, like different people focus on different aspects. Well, let's back up a second. So the AI extinction people, like, what is their case that AI would lead to human extinction? That's a pretty big claim.
If we had a black hole, and instead of the sun, as long as the black hole was the same mass as the sun, we wouldn't get sucked up. We would only die from eternal darkness.
Did you know that?
I didn't know it. I know it now, though. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So the extinction claim, I mean, it can be a few different things. I mean, it ranges from sort of, this hyper practical sense of like, well, if folks lose their jobs and that could be an existential crisis for them, or to, okay, well, what if we have this sort of like essentially auto hacking thing happening where there are like mass system outages and now our entire sort of economy and well-being is tied into these systems. So if that happens, what does that look like? To sort of like mass resource use, and how does it play into or accelerate the climate crisis. And then on the other hand, there are, this whole range of sort of philosophical possibilities, things that could happen. Chief amongst those is what I think folks call the alignment problem, which is really that, we build something, either artificial general intelligence, which is AI systems that are as capable as human beings at most cognitive tasks, or artificial superintelligence, which is artificial intelligence that's better at human beings at virtually every task, to include sort of like relationship, emotional, sort of the things that we think that only humans can do. If we get to that point, there's the question of like, okay, well, can these systems become malign and actively hostile toward human beings? And then the other possibility is, okay, well, do they even need to be malignant or hostile to human beings? Or is it possible that they could just be misaligned with human values? And so, kind of surreptitiously slough off human beings.
Right.
That's another possibility. I think
They decide that human beings are no longer useful for their purposes.
So
Yeah.
I can't take a nursery.
Well, he's worried that we're gonna start a tree nursery, an edible tree nursery, and he's worried that we're not gonna do the nursery if that happens. I am too.
yeah, we all are. I mean, like me personally, just looking at this personally, I very much have sort of a C.S. Lewis, what do we do in light of the bomb attitude about this stuff.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that we don't take it seriously. And especially when we have, sort of these tech leaders like Jeffrey Hinton. And, he's the easiest example. Even folks within these like large AI labs have acknowledged that there's some existential risk, that there's a non-zero chance of extinction. What I think, speaking specifically to Stop AI, the group that I went to San Francisco to sort of to sort of chat with, I think what they would say is that for tech billionaires to pursue something at breakneck speed, that they acknowledge there's a non-zero chance or non-zero risk of extinction is de facto irresponsible and
Right.
frankly,
They're making that decision for everybody else.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think, certainly Guido, who is one of the founders of Stop AI, he's really sort of well-read in all of the possible theories, all of the potential outcomes. And he takes, I would say, a pretty strong-handed approach. He really does think, there's this other idea about this moment of singularity, the moment that like AI reaches artificial general intelligence, that it will just continue to like self-improve and
Right.
self-improve and self-improve. So it's essentially the, if anybody builds it, everyone dies theory, that like as soon as that happens, that it just continues to self-iterate. I think, frankly, I think that's very hard for people to entertain as even a probability. Like any of these things are difficult to entertain as probabilities because the human mind does not work well in uncertain spaces. And I think that's part of what makes this very difficult, is that there is no, it doesn't matter who you ask. Nobody can tell you for sure how this turns out.
Yeah.
And so this thing that we're entertaining as human beings, where it's like, well, this could happen, or this could happen, or this could happen. I think it's really difficult for us. And I think, one of the things, and not to go too far afield here, I'm just like rambling at this point, but one of the things that I think these folks are, sort of constantly sorting for themselves and constantly sorting out among themselves is, well, do we focus on these like potential catastrophic outcomes, or is it better, / does that freak people out so much that they either shut off or get so scared that they're kind of, they shut down? Or on the other hand, should we be focusing on these near-term, relatively insignificant harms, but still significant?
Yes.
Relative to extinction, everything is insignificant. But should we be focused more on the environmental harm? Should we be focused more on jobs loss? there's a lot of disagreement among folks about, what that looks like.
Yeah, your article kind of talked about a split, and it seemed kind of similar to what happened with like the Occupy Wall Street movement, where like one of the founders kind of split off to become more radical for direct action and, basically get himself arrested and, things of that nature. And then the other one was more kind of what you're just talking about now. And it seems like a similar kind of thing has happened with this movement.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's right. But I think, one of the things that I kept thinking about while I was writing this story is that there is obviously, I mean, this almost goes without saying, obviously massive funding mechanism behind pro AI lobbying. And so these folks are all sort of like constantly with, relatively no resources, constantly grappling with this machine of influence that exists within the AI sphere. Really, that lot, I think, are trying to cut any opposition off at the root. It's not totally fair, frankly, because if we think about any other movement, even the environmental movement is a good example. I mean, there are obviously a lot of different kinds of environmentalist organizations that play all kinds of different roles. And so,
Before, when I said Occupy Wall Street, I meant Extinction Rebellion.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know about Occupy Wall Street. I don't think they had two founders. Just wanted to, just in case anyone was confused. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I do think, yeah, that's a really good example because I think, on the one hand, like I really love the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and I really love what they do at sort of a local level. And I think that they've made some real strides in protecting the bay. Well, that's hyper localized and they're like the opposite of a direct action group. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
very intentional, very sort of like bought into the system as the system exists. So I think the framing of like any sort of public opposition at this point as radical. And it really even Stop AI. Like when we're talking about sort of direct action for Stop AI, they've done lock-ons where they've like locked themselves to doors or locked doors shut, and they've done sit-ins where they've blocked entrances. Other than that, Guido independently, and I talk about this in the article, has done now 2 separate hunger strikes.
Yeah.
We're not talking about like property destruction. We're not talking about like really anything that I think we would think of today as extreme, or maybe not even think of as extreme because it's so commonplace now in all kinds of different lanes of resistance that it just is part of the political discourse. Really, these guys are pretty, I would say, relative to other social movements.
Yeah.
They've been pretty mild mannered.
Yeah.
With the exception of Sam Kirshner, who
Yeah.
that I talk about in the story.
Right. He disappeared. People don't know where he is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even with Sam, like, if we're looking at this honestly as human beings and not through the lens of either supporting the development of frontier models or even through the lens of AI resistance, we're talking about a human being who clearly is in like psychological trouble.
Yeah. I mean, you can't sit with like human extinction and thinking that it's like absolutely going to happen unless you're able to stop these specific companies from doing the specific thing and stay psychologically healthy, which
Well,
is,
and this is what I
yeah.
mean about just sort of like human psychology. And I've not been in that position, and I can't speak to what that must feel like, but I can speak to much lesser things where, I've been concerned that something might happen. And especially when you start to involve family members. I mean, the other Stop AI members said repeatedly that the thing that he was most concerned about was harm of his sister, who he has a very close relationship with.
Yeah.
And so I think, and again, I'm speaking as a layperson, but somebody who has been in a situation where you start to feel like this deep sense of dread that something that, may potentially happen at some point in the future is absolutely going to happen. At that point, I think it's very, very hard to bring somebody back from that. And I do think in that regard, I really wish in a way, and I think it's kind of messy because I think the people who the theorists who posit that these things could happen, it's very serious to them, and they feel a strong sense of urgency, and they really feel a human responsibility to warn other people. But I do think there's a case to be made for sort of like figuring out how to talk to the public about these things. Even among tech executives, again, who agree that there's some chance that some of these things could happen. I think there has to be an understanding that um, that the human mind is going to seize on certainties when there are none. That's just how the brain works. I really, I mean, I'll tell you personally, I'm very concerned about this kid. I don't know him, but of course I'm worried. Like it's been more than 3 months at this point. So I really like clearly I do not agree with the sort of like violent posture that he took in any way, shape, or form. There's sort of conflicting reports about threats that he made, if threats were made toward any of these AI companies. Obviously, that is not something that I would ever condone or agree with. But I also think like this is a person who could be in imminent harm to
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
It really bothers me that when we talk about these big political things, that like the actual human outcome seems to kind of get pushed by the wayside.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I haven't paid as much attention to this debate as you, I think, but I mean, my general sense is like a couple of years ago, AI alignments at least was popping on my radar more. And then I think, I mean, the sense I got is that people with power decided that, well, there are these risks, but if we don't develop it, China will.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like this multipolar trap where it's like, I don't want to develop this potentially deadly technology, whatever it is, but my competitor will develop it if I don't, and then they'll use it to take me over. Right. And
Yeah.
I think that there's almost like this inexorable logic where it's like we can't stop. We have to, I guess if it's going to be developed anyway, then we have to do it because at least it'll be on our terms, not their terms.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, again, that's just a very, like, I haven't followed it very closely, but that's just the general sense I've gotten.
That is the argument, and that seems to be the winning argument right now.
Seems to be, yeah.
As of today, I personally have a difficult time with that argument in part because it's the argument that we make about everything. And at a certain point, I do think there's a question of like, do you become your geopolitical enemy to own your geopolitical enemy? And, that's kind of the question that I have is that like there does seem to be and there's some I think disagreement about this on the fringes, but there seems to be an acknowledgement that this is going to result at the very minimum in mass jobs loss. And and to your point, it's kind of like, well, the way that I've heard this described is good guy with an AI versus a bad guy with an AI. First of all, I'm not convinced that some of these tech executives are good guys. Like, yeah, I think that this feels like something to me that maybe I'm wrong about, but I think just looking at the culture of San Francisco is really telling because San Francisco, I mean, obviously there's like mass homelessness in San Francisco. They say not to walk through the Tenderloin. I did. It is like, and maybe this sounds Pollyannish, but I am Pollyannish, so it's not going to bother me to say this. Part of me thought this is a political, this sort of look at San Francisco, look at these people, look at open use, look what's going on here was kind of a political dunk, like just an easy thing to say. It was like alarming to me to the point of like being disorienting for a few hours, what I saw in the span of 2 blocks. And just frankly, within that city, the like disparities between like, these incredible buildings where, these like world changing technologies are supposed to be being developed and, all of these promises that are made about, how it's going to change society, how it's going to
Right. A lot of
solve.
utopianism is tech
Exactly.
utopianism coming out of there.
Exactly. But the thing that really like concerns me is these are people who seem to be able to walk through their own city with disparities existing there and kind of just shrug. And so that's very difficult for me. So again, I do think that like the culture of a city, the culture of the place where these things are frankly being, you know, developed does, I think, we can say it doesn't matter, but like, I think it does matter. Really, really telling about what's actually going on. And the China thing, again, like it's an argument that it's basically the argument that's made for everything. But like we decided to trade with China. We decided to let China build, to let China buy chips. Like we there are a lot of decisions that we make that sort of are empowering to China and to China's economy. And then, so we're doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're saying, well, we have to do this because what if they beat us? And it's like, is there a third thing that we
Right.
could do? You know, and I don't know that I buy that argument. It just feels very, very convenient, to me. And I'm not sure that really anybody buys that argument. It's very, very easy to make.
Maybe it's just a useful kind of excuse. Well, there's a lot of other aspects of this that you kind of hinted at already. I mean, one is the potential job loss. I mean, so this is like really kind of interesting conversation because on the one hand, it's like, a lot of people don't like their jobs. They'd rather be doing something else. And so some people argue that, well, this will free people up to pursue what they really love because AI and robots are handling all of the jobs that we don't like, all of the emails that we don't want to send, and whatever else, right, that we don't want to do. But on the other hand, our society isn't really built to provide a safety net for when people do lose their jobs. And even if they did, even if there was like a universal basic income, would that actually really be a healthy society where
Yeah.
like, would people just sink down into nihilism and addictions and all of this stuff? And it seems, I mean, according to some people's predictions, like it's happening really soon. It's happening now. We're already seeing signs of it happening now, and it's happening really soon. Yeah. How do you see that kind of potential landscape of job loss and how society is gonna,
Yeah.
depending on what levels it is and how fast, how society is gonna react?
Think, um I think the argument that, there's this argument that like, well, we have a new technology and we'll adapt to this new technology and there will be new jobs and blah, 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 blah. I feel that, first of all, the people who are making those arguments are not the people working in those jobs. They're basically zero or effectively zero people saying like, yes, please AI, take my job so that I can do so and so.
Without any income.
Yeah, exactly. Or, and not to make everything Appalachia, but I'm going to about this.
Please. Oh, please.
Coal, like, isn't that what we've told about coal? Was like, no, they're going to be these new economy jobs, and so you can learn to code. Well, now what are we hearing? Oh, don't learn to code. Coding jobs are going away.
Yeah, that was literally like all through COVID, everyone was like, learn to code.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so, this notion too, and the other thing is that there's something about the human spirit. It's always like freaking like Mr. Burns looking office dwellers who are making this argument because there's a certain type of mind who says, well, of course, if you could live like me, wouldn't you want to live like me? And the answer to that question is a resounding no. We already saw that in COVID. There are people of a certain stripe who want to do physical, difficult, labor intensive, shitty jobs. There are also people who want to sit on email all day, who love answering emails, who feel great about their email job, who, like brag to their parents about how meaningful their employment feels. And it is meaningful to them because they're working with human beings. They're, generally if you work at a company, hopefully you feel like you're advancing something. If you're not fulfilled by the work that you're doing on behalf of the company, maybe you feel like you're improving your own skill set so that you can, go pursue something that you do want to do. This notion that like they're going to be all these fulfilling sort of creative job, where the fuck are these jobs coming from? Like those jobs I'm writing now. I can, it's like you can write we don't go into sort of like rates of pay for some of these publications, but there are publications that are paying right, and thank God I work with none of them and would and hope that I don't have to go there, but who, pay a writer $250 for like a 2,000 word piece that's like deeply
Right.
reported. And, so this notion that there are going to be all of these like wonderful creative jobs that just like manifest, no, they're not. No, they're
Yeah.
not. The other thing, I really I want to believe strongly in the idea of an alternative economy that can pop up. And I still to a certain extent do believe in that. But again, I live in an economy that was that was sustained by an industry that's already been decimated. And yeah, I was thinking about this. I know we've talked about this before. I was thinking about this today. I think half of my friends, I went to public high school for 2 years. And I think half of my close friend group has passed away from like related deaths. And so this notion that like you can take something away and have maybe a hypothetical stopgap or a hypothetical like this could happen, or frankly, even, the notion of universal basic income, depending on what that looks like. I don't think it's consistent with human nature. I think if people wanted to leave their jobs and pursue creative endeavors, that they would do that. And we don't see a lot of people doing that, or in some cases we see these jobs being a source of income for people who are already pursuing those kinds of things. There are people, and I think, you and I are varying iterations of this, but like people who work full-time jobs or who work in some way in sort of like a normal position, and then also try to farm and try to like move towards something that's a little bit more localized. People who want to do that are starting to do it. There are a lot of people who don't want to do that and frankly will not know what to do when they're not getting up and going to work. And I think, the biggest thing is not, again, that like we're infantilizing these people or babysitting them. It's that they're not saying they want their job to be replaced. Like these people are not, like, no, please AI, take my job. Like there's none of that. Um, so I feel really frustrated by those arguments. And I think, again, like there are places that are thriving. Most of those places seem to be kind of urban and suburban places. If you travel around the United States or even travel around sort of our part of the country, you will see these places that were once thriving that have just been decimated by economic choices that have been made. And so this notion that's like, well, we'll bounce back. And I really am like so tired of, again, hearing, I feel like it's one particular stripe of libertarian who like live a very comfortable existence in a city, who never really have to talk to people who have experiences that are very, very different than their experiences. And their posture is, but you can buy television for $200.
Right.
And or wouldn't it be awful if you weren't able to buy an iPhone? And would that be awful? Is it awful that you can't pay your electric bill? Is it awful that you can't afford to keep your heat on? Like, I mean, the way that people are actually living in places that have been holed out by the economic decisions that have been made is such a far cry, I think, from what these people are talking about, that it's like, no, we already have a blueprint of how this looks, and it doesn't look good. It does
Yeah.
not look good. We have not, if we had some example that we could point to historically and say, see how we did this, see how we took care of people who we replaced your display. We don't have an example of that. There's no example of that. So that notion that it's all going to be like this Cinderella world where it's like AI touches you and you get UBI and you turn to gold and start painting like the Sistine Chapel is just a freaking like,
Right.
like I say, it's like a corporatist pipe dream.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this kind of leads me to think about, the other aspect of this resistance that we've seen a lot lately is data centers, centered around data centers, right? So, I mean, you've already kind of mentioned all of this a little bit, but, one thing about AI is it's very energy hungry. Um, it's also very water hungry for these data centers. And I think people are realizing, for all the reasons we've talked about why they're very, resistant to this kind of rapid AI takeover. They've targeted data centers as kind of like, this is where we have some leverage
Yeah.
because, I can help resist the data center coming into my community. I can make the arguments to people that, it's not going to bring that very many jobs and it's going to, raise your electric bill and your water bill probably, and it might have these environmental harms. And so we're seeing that various places that data center plans have been shut down right now. There's other people who argue, like, so I posted something about this and then some of the responses were like, well, if they don't build in your community, they're going to build it somewhere else. That's just being NIMBY, right? Not in my
Yeah.
backyard. But it's like, well, we live in a networked world. We're all hooked up to the internet. This could become a movement that spreads in a lot of places, right?
Yeah.
And just it raises the friction, the cost of building these data centers, making the model not financially viable and eventually, maybe eventually folding. Curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so that's kind of how I found my way into this issue. And I actually feel more comfortable talking about this than I do about the broader sort of
Right.
AI stuff.
Yeah.
But, and I think you know this about me already. I'm sure I've said it before, but like not in my backyard is as viable an argument as any other argument in my
Yeah.
position.
I
I
mean,
mean,
people have a right to like have a say about what happens where they live. I
yeah,
mean,
exactly. Exactly. And, especially in cases where rezoning is required, which is it frankly almost always is, like essentially, are you going to why are data centers not built in cities? Well, one thing is obviously high population, but also the value of the property. And so these developers, seek out the cheapest possible land that they can find, which usually is either farm or forest land. So that to begin with is already like a question mark for me is like, where are these being built? How are these decisions being made? I think that a lot of that decision making also has to do with people who don't have a lot of political bargaining power. So people in rural places that have a low population, usually an aging population, or at least often an aging population. Some cases, as in Memphis, a sort of historically disenfranchised population. So they're already like baseline kind of like, well, where are you building these things and why are you choosing to build them there? The
becomes an
second thing,
environmental justice issue.
yeah, exactly. The second thing is sort of the jobs thing. There's already been sort of a broad admission that this is not the job creator that folks promised that it would be on the front end. And so, things like I've had conversations. There's sort of a effort now in Wise County where I live to build a data center cluster. And one of the things that I think, you know, one of the things that comes up is, well, are these people likely, are they likely to resist? I even know sort of like how
Yeah.
to coalesce around this thing. But, the resource use thing and I've say it's been fascinating to watch because there's a huge sort of again lobbying effort against this that says, okay, well there's one error in one report. And so this doesn't actually use the water that we think that it uses. I would encourage people as far as sort of resource use to look at the specific project proposals because ultimately these developers go to folks, to local water authorities, local companies, utility companies and make the request, make their request based on what they think they're going to use to begin with. Now, that usually is like a starting point. They always end up trying to expand. But if there's any sort of like skepticism about the resource use, that's a good way to address it is go look at the actual estimates that the developers are making in their sort of like interactions with water authorities, utility companies, etc. I think it really did start as like being purely grassroots resistance. And to me, I found it to be I think somebody on X had asked, like, well, how is it different than solar development or lithium development?
Yeah.
It's not different. I mean, developers always use the same kind of approach. They kind of try to backdoor things that, sometimes there are NDAs between the developer and public officials, which I think is absolutely like abysmal and should not be allowed in a democratic republic. But it is, and it happens. So, I would say it's the same as any other kind of development. The way in which it's different is that it provides, virtually very few jobs. So, a community that might be willing to make resource trades, or deal with the loss of farmland or deal with the loss of forest land, for a job creator, that's not what they're getting. Only it's essentially billed as a local revenue machine.
Right.
The issue with even that is that, Virginia is like, I mean, it's literally Northern Virginia is the data center capital of the world. And in Virginia, they have extended such mass tax incentives to these companies at the state level
Right.
that essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul. So
Right. So it's
you're
if the argument is like it's going to fill up local government coffers and help build schools and stuff, well, if they're offering these tax incentives, it's not even going to do that.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, the other thing is that a lot of these developers at this point, they're developing data center facilities without an end user. So the opportunity that a locality might have to negotiate with an end user about again, we're going to make these trade-offs, but we want you in addition to real estate taxes or whatever the local tax local taxes that they are able to bring in are going to be. We want you to commit to build a new school, to repair all of these, but which frankly for these companies at the amount that they're willing to pay in some cases, it's like very easy stuff. But again, like localities usually don't even have that opportunity if they're working with a developer rather than an end user. Developers are going to make whatever promises they need to make to get through. I mean, that's how it goes. And so I think a big reason that there has been this, like, to get back to your question, I'm traveling on far field, but
No, it's all relevant. It's all relevant. So keep going.
I think the reason that there has been this sort of like, growth of the movement as a potential resistance to AI is because folks who do have data centers in their communities who may not have understood what it would mean on the front end have now begun to understand what some of the repercussions of that have been. And some of those are, quality of life, just like this massive like whirring of these generators all the time. Some of it is, okay, well, we thought we had enough, water. We didn't. Now you're ground pumping. Now our wells have gone dry. Like, all of these things that happen with massive development on the scale. And so I think now these other communities are starting to see like, okay, well, now we're able to, I mean, this is essentially how we hope federalism will work, right? Is that like you look at another locality, you see that things have not, in fact, gone as well for that locality as they might have, as they might have hoped. And so then you benefit from that decision in your decision making. But unfortunately, that's not usually what happens in development. What happens is that you get some like, half cooked, like, guy who's on your sort of like local board of supervisors who has been told by some greater authority or some economic development authority that, like, of course, this is a good idea because XYZ reason. They never do any research. They never talk to any other public officials. I mean, and in Virginia, there have been entire sort of like, governing bodies that have been removed or, voted out over these decisions. But again, that's not something that I think at the local decision making level is ever even contemplated. So I don't think it works that way. And again, like I think the thing too that folks have to understand about this coordination, which I think, people have a tendency to think that any sort of coordinated resistance is in some way disingenuous or insincere.
Right.
One thing that I think, and I've seen this, especially, I reported a story for Unheard in Alabama about a data center proposal there. And it, is going to affect two communities, both sort of retirement communities, one predominantly white and one predominantly black. Two like widely respected communities, great people, very, very loving people, welcoming, have done everything right their whole lives, just want to live out, their years in peace. Well, now they're in a position where they essentially have to become experts on every aspect of what could happen with a data center.
Yeah.
And so essentially, I think what's happening to some extent is that there's, a resource sharing campaign where folks, again, who have already kind of fought this fight in their community are going to people who are like, oh my gosh, what does evaporative cooling even mean? And saying like, okay, well, this is what this looks like. Here's some data. And I think, again, these people are up against this like incredible lobbying machine, just incredible. And so, I do think, yeah, obviously, time causing these developers and tech companies to expend time and expend resources is probably the only sort of like tool available to people at this point. You're so
And I think there a lot of the economy right now seems to, at least the stock market, seems to be AI hype and growth of this stuff. And it quite possibly might be a bubble, right? And the financials aren't actually very good, right? In the long term, and the more friction you make, it could just all collapse. That would be,
yeah.
one scenario, maybe.
I mean, it's certainly possible. I found that the sort of like goings on this last week between Anthropic and the Department of War and OpenAI and the Department of War to be interesting in part because based on a lot of the reporting that I've read, OpenAI is not in a great financial situation as it stands. And so the fact that they would sort of like, to me, it made like the most sense in the world that, and the Department of War would have this disagreement, and the OpenAI, no matter the terms, would jump in.
Right. They're more desperate.
Yeah, it
Right.
kind of, yeah, it made sense. But
And
I
they're going
also,
to be even more desperate now because their user base and even a lot of people working for them are quitting it. Right. And it just goes to
well,
show that this is on people's radar now and people have
yeah. And I actually think that I think it's really powerful when safety researchers step down and step away. And I think it's really powerful when they articulate their reasoning for stepping down and stepping away. Because again, I think so many of these conversations happen behind this like screen that, that most of us are not even sort of like considering. The thing that I find fascinating really is that like some of these things, some of the things that have happened and are already happening, the way that I think that some of these tech CEOs talk about these issues and potential outcomes of the development of AGI, it does bother me that there's still a lot of people who are like, "Oh, that sounds like science fiction," and just
Yeah.
like, sure,
Yeah.
because I'm like, but they're saying it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, but you know, to your point, the thing that worries me about that is that I can't remember the language that Sam Altman used exactly, but it was something like the government, some description of the government along the lines of the insurer of last resort, which is to say that like the taxpayer will always be footing the bill. And it feels to me that we have sort of established a paradigm for that where it's like, well, we had to, this sort of like too big to fail, or, this is such a core part of our
Right.
economy is
Well, the more it's integrated with government agencies, with kind of core functionality and energy infrastructure and all of these things, at a certain point, it does become too big to fail.
yeah,
And that's
exactly.
scary itself. Yeah.
So and I think this is what really bothers me. And again, sorry, I just jump around all over the place, but like the data center thing is essentially like, don't worry, this is going to be really great. We're going to use your resources and your community and your land to develop technologies that hopefully, all things, if everything works out, will replace your job.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
again, I think there's this notion that like folks who work in the trades are going to be insulated from this stuff. But, there've been incredible advancements in robotics as well.
Yeah.
So I think this notion that like just go over there and you'll be safe. I don't know that that's necessarily true. And it's just really for me, it's just the hubris of let us do this so that we can replace your job. And there's even still a lot of conversation among, I mean, I just talked to some state lawmakers about this in Virginia, and expressed my concerns about this data center. And the response was, well, I don't know what we're going to do because we have all these devices and people want to be online, people want to be on their computers and they just want to use their devices all the time. Well, these data centers are being built, are being built to power frontier research. I mean, if we did not have adequate support for the devices that we're using and the things that we're doing now, we would have blackouts all the time. That's not what it's being
Right.
used for.
Yeah.
So, again, it feels very hubristic to me that these companies are essential. And this is probably the part that just galls me is that these companies are like, no, people, like, let us do this so that we can replace you. And then we'll figure out what to do with you later. I
Right.
mean, that to me is not politics.
Yeah.
You've jumped the shark at that point. It's something else.
Well, it seems like the arguments that they make is that, well, this is going to cure cancer. This is going to solve a lot of societal problems. We haven't really seen any evidence of that. What do you make of these claims that, the reason we need to pursue AI is that it'll provide the intelligence to solve some of these core problems in our society?
I think again, I mean, as I mentioned before, I think it's a little bit too cute, given that they've shown absolutely zero interest in solving the existing problems in society that they have that are within their power to help solve.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
one piece
Go
of
back to
it.
San Francisco and the state of the city. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, another piece of this is that their argument against sort of, all of the quote unquote AI doomers who say this could result in existential risk is that those are probabilistic arguments. But the arguments that they're making in favor of like all of this like utopic potential that this technology has are also probabilistic arguments. So, I mean, I think you can't sort of have your pie and eat it too on that. Like you either have to say, okay, you kind of have to acknowledge, like, of all potential outcomes, we think these outcomes are more likely. Well, why? We don't know. I mean,
Yeah. Because
that
we hope
can't.
so.
Yeah, that's not a good enough answer. And I think again, like to me, the resource use, it is of concern to me that we talk so much about renewable energy for so long. And that now that these big tech companies need electricity and they want to use fossil fuels and natural gas, that it's like, but they're gonna solve the climate problem later. Well, no, you
Right.
don't that. You don't go into a community and destroy forest land and farmland and tell people that their homes and their properties don't matter. And then say, but we really have a heart for solving this issue. No, you don't. You
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah,
So
and you're making people's local issues almost unsolvable. Like once you cut down a forest, you don't just get a forest back in 10
yeah,
years. You know,
yeah,
you don't just get a fertile farmland back after you've, polluted it with all these metals and stuff. Like it just doesn't happen that way. And
no,
yeah, and once the community fabric has been destroyed, you don't just get that back either. And so it's not, it's a disingenuous argument.
no, it's a disingenuous argument. And there's also something to me, you know, going back just briefly to the environmental justice issue, especially when it comes to aging populations, I think we have a real cultural problem when it comes to aging communities and just aging people. I mean, these are people who, traditionally, at least in the Appalachian and really by Appalachian in this sense, I mean Cherokee way of being, your elders are the most important people in your society. Those are the people who can tell you what has happened, the mistakes that they've made, ways that they wish that they had behaved differently, ways that they wish that they had responded differently. You know, the people who can tell you really about yourself and your community. And what we essentially are saying to these people with all different kinds of development in these communities is you do not matter. Your days of productivity have ended. Not only is your sort of role as a cultural custodian unwanted, it actually thwarts what we want to do, which is essentially cultural. At the point at which you erase somebody's culture, I feel that you've really made them like it's impossible for them to resist almost anything at that point because they have no grounding, they have no foundation. And so to me, I think again, like these neighborhoods where there are these elders and people who, I mean, we're talking about Alabama, we're talking about in that community, we're talking about like 20 minutes outside of Birmingham. These are people who like really have lived lives that we can't even begin to understand in this generation. And we're like, oh no, I'm sorry, we need this for a data center. And it's like this cannot be the way that we treat each other as human beings. And so yeah, I mean, to get back to your point about like all of the problems that it's going to solve, I don't believe that that's true. And I also think, I mean, as a religious person, I think that these people are godless people who believe that they're building a god. And
I mean, they've said so. They've said so themselves.
yeah, and I traditionally, you know, in the Abrahamic religions, that has not ended well.
That kind of hubris in general does not end well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's a part of me, I guess, in that sense, that feels like this battle's already been fought and won. And so while I feel exhausted by it and I feel very upset by it and frustrated by sort of the direction that we're moving in, I also feel like, okay, but there's also truth. And there is what is human and there is what is divine. Um, you know, I frankly don't think that we're not I don't think. I mean, in speaking through a lens of faith, I do not believe that we will sort of transcend our role as a God created being to become like gods. Um, so this notion that like the system is somehow, the system that again I believe is God created is somehow going to be jolted and sort of like overcome by technology. That's wildly wildly hubristic. But again, I think that battle's already been won.
In your ideal scenario, or even like from the perspective of faith, do you see any kind of role for, maybe some kind of limited AI for certain things, or even, that's from a practical perspective. From a faith perspective, do you see any significance in this idea that we're making machines intelligent? I actually I don't think that machines will ever be conscious. And I think there's good philosophical reasons for that and religious reasons as well. But like in your ideal scenario, would this just kind of be stamped out and forgotten as kind of this, hubristic mistake that we all woke up from, or do you see? I guess, what direction would you like to see technology go,
Yeah.
and in particular this kind of technology?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think that do I want to see it stomped out? I think that I do think that we're engaged in an arms race, and I think it's frankly a corporatist arms race. And I think that's what's fueling a lot of this. I don't ascribe to the sort of like demon in the machine position, except to the extent that it's a reflection of ourselves and our own sort of like desires for power and money,
So if
and
it
kind
was
of
if it was arising from a different political economy, like let's say it was whatever, whatever, fill in the blank, decentralized, democratic agrarianism, or whatever, whatever. And this technology was being developed with better values in mind. Do you think, like, how much of it is how much reflection of our society now, and it's just amplifying that, versus the technology itself is evil?
I think it's an amplification of our society now, fully. Yeah. I think that's exactly what it is. I think if it were possible for us to I
It's a
feel
big it's a big theoretical, and it might be
yeah,
a
no, but I feel a bit
meaningless question, really.
well, I feel a bit ridiculous answering in this way because but at the same time not because I genuinely believe that God is on the throne and prayer changes things and that God is capable of anything. But, I think ultimately what we would need to see is a mass revival. And I think care about each other as, as brothers and as sisters. And, this sort of like notion that we have where we think about people as statistics or think about a percentage of job loss or what does this look like or how can we solve for this, but start to see human beings as individuals and care for those individuals. Again, I think that there are some people who believe that they're really doing that. I think that they believe that they're making something. I don't think, in other words, I don't think that the people who say, well, we have to make this because it will be great for humanity are disingenuous as much as they are delusional about the limits of achievement, I guess, in a certain sense. And not achievement in like a physical or scientific or technological way, but in a spiritual way. We're not
Yeah,
going to overcome death. We're
yeah.
not. I mean, except through the blood of Jesus Christ, we're not overcoming death. It's just not happening. And that's my genuine religious belief. I also think that, to your point about like different circumstances, what if we built this in different circumstances? I feel that way about everything. I mean, I feel that, one reason that I feel so strongly that, the corporate model has been such a massive failure is that the human being is not at the center of the corporate model. But what's at the center of the corporate model is power seeking and wealth seeking. And, I think that anything that's built that does not have the human being at the center. And again, like the human being through a divine lens where we can love each other in spite of our shortcomings. Mine chief of my most. But I think that yeah, I think that's a problem. I don't think that any technology that we build that we try to manage for our ends when our ends are not, I mean, speaking of alignment, not spiritually aligned, can be good. I don't think it can. And I just don't I feel so in a way, and again, like this is very kind of simple and sweet, I think, in a way. But it's very hard for me to understand how we went from believing that a man's job was dignified and important and part of what gave him kind of standing and dignity in society to let's just give them like a couple thou a month and,
Yeah,
it'll work itself out.
yeah.
That to me, I think is really dangerous thinking.
Yeah.
And there has not been a good there's not going to be there has not been, and I don't believe that there will be an adequate response to that. This notion, especially the way that we're building, um, and I follow, what is it called? I think More Perfect Union, which is like I think Democratic Socialist podcast. I hope I'm not like mischaracterizing them, but that's how I would put it. Something that they're like constantly sort of talking about that I agree with is this like gamification of the economy, where
Yeah.
it's like, okay, well, as long as you're consuming, even if it's on credit, like we're going to build more, poly market is totally legitimate and fun for pundits to joke about. Casinos are wonderful. They're like great for the economy. Even like these little like tech games that where you can invest money, people can lose money, and all of these things
I
where
mean,
people,
crypto
yeah, it's
is just a financial gambling racket, really. I mean, some
yeah,
people are trying to do interesting things, but overall,
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the fact that we're like, this will turn out fine. Like we'll just use human beings' baser instincts, and I think not even baser instincts. I think things that we're psychologically particularly susceptible to when we're in depression, and then set up the circumstances for depression and be like, no, guys, it's going to be great.
yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't think it will be. It doesn't sound like it will be. I think, yeah. I mean, that's just in a perfect world, or even in a better world, I think we could have a technology like this and make something good out of it. But right now, I mean, really, like godlike language and the transhumanist language really freaks me out.
Anywhere near that.
Yeah.
Well, before we depart from this topic, I want to ask you about what your ideas for gardening are. But before we depart from this topic, is there anything that we haven't covered with regards to the whole AI discussion or just things that you,
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed, and again, I'm really not an expert on this issue. I'm just an outsider sort of peering in. But one thing that really has started to bug me is the political divides separating people who are sort of on the same side of the issue.
yeah,
I think folks have to get over that. Like this notion that you can never sort of work with or be in society or community with somebody who doesn't agree with you about 100% of everything political that's ever happened is extremely childish, and is frankly only serving the advancement of the technology.
yeah, corporate interests in general.
100%. 100%. And I would add, because this is one of the things, I'm sure, to your point about me going out to San Francisco, culturally, completely opposite.
Yeah, yeah.
Nothing could not have been more
Just trying to imagine you walking to, hanging out in San Francisco.
very different, but at the same time, the people that I talk to who are part of Stop AI, and I talked to some folks at Pause AI too, and that maybe will be for a future story. But I found everybody that I talked to be so delightful and genuinely concerned about human flourishing. And so again, I just think with any issue, but this issue in particular, where the touch points, the ones that I've been talking passionately about are populist touch points. I think we have to get over this notion that it's like your side versus my side, and think about the actual sort of, impacts. And I do think that those people, and in some cases folks were guided by faith. It was a very different theology than the theology I ascribe to, but in my view, we serve the same God. That's what we're trying to do, is to try to show God's love for other people through action. And so I think we need to think more
Yeah.
about getting over ourselves.
Yeah. Well, one anecdote that I just noticed online. So I had done a post about resistant data centers, and most of the people who liked that, interacted with it, you broadly say were leftists. And then at the same time, the same day or the same couple of days, there was a lot of anti-AI content about kind of the spiritual implications of AI, and that was more, you could call, traditional minded people. But, and so these two, they were both fighting against the same thing, a different aspect of it. I
Yeah.
think both equally legitimate aspects. One was more just kind of like the material aspects of it, and one was more the spiritual aspects. But they're both all integrated together, really. And it was just very interesting to me that like these two sets of people hate each other
Yeah.
for the most part, right? With a
Yeah.
few exceptions, and yet they both have a common enemy, really.
Yeah, and I think what's really been interesting to me about seeing sort of localized data center resistance is that they work together brilliantly.
Yeah, yeah, there's a whole huge difference between online and
Yep.
cooperating online. One thing we've learned about with Theo is that, like we were kind of Pollyannish going in and like we're gonna build bridges between these ideological divides. And we found that on at least online, it's almost impossible. On a
Yeah.
podcast, it's a little bit easier because at least you're talking with people face to face. But really, it has to be in person in communities on specific issues where you might not like their politics, but you can at least build some camaraderie, working towards a similar goal. And
Yeah.
that's relationships develop out of that, and those relationships can last. And that really can't happen on Twitter or something equivalent.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, very, very quickly, two things that stick out to me. This stuff I feel like never makes it into the stories because it's very kind of like gushy parents stuff.
We love
But
Gucci here at Do More Optimism.
but Guido, one of the things that I had written about that did make it into the final cut was that when I like went to his house, there were like all these clovers in his neighbor's yard. And I asked him if he ever found four-leaf clovers. And he was like, "No, do you ever find them?" And I was like, "No, I can't. I have no eye for that." He was like, "Well, these are actually wood sorrel. And they have this little yellow flower." He's like, "They're edible. Some people make a drink out of them. So you can, pick the flat." And he just like picked two, ate one, gave one to me. I ate the other one. It's very hard when that's your starting point to think like, well, this person, because we don't share the same faith or we don't share the same political views, we're not sort of in line with each other. We've already shared a moment that's like so definitionally human that it's like anything after this, we're probably going to be okay.
Yeah.
The same thing in Alabama. It's like these in Alabama, the majority of the resistance was from like very MAGA people. It's Alabama,
Yeah.
like,
Right. Yeah.
but there were all of these other folks who sort of like coalesced around the issue, not for political reasons, but because they care about their neighbors. And the way that ends up looking is actually what I mean. Speaking of doer optimism, so endlessly optimistic to me because that's what actual community is just that care for each other. I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just tying this back, that's the danger with all of this is that it destroys the fabric of community, and that's where we have to push back against the most, right? Because if
Yes.
we fight with each other over differences that ultimately are not in our interests, we're actually destroying, like we're actually playing into their hands
Yeah.
by further destroying the fabric of community, and it's a death spiral.
That's exactly right. And I think a big part of that is like essentially a lie that we're being taught that we don't have any obligation to each other. And in fact, obligation is kind of the fabric of a community. Um, and again, like I think older people as sort of culture keepers and custodians are really, really essential to just the human project is like figuring out who am I now and who do I aspire to be? And what can that look like? It doesn't have to look like freaking, online influencer XYZ. It can look like Joe who like lives two houses down.
Right, right.
That's really good.
Doesn't have a social media account.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I wanted to mention, you mentioned wood sorrel. Cleo calls that lemon heart. That's right. It's kind of like sour and it looks like a heart.
It's perfect. I'm calling it that now. I'm gonna tell Guido that too.
Yeah, please do. Please do. It sounds more human to me than wood sorrel, which is just whatever.
Uh, it also sounds like perfectly quintessentially Appalachian to have a name like that.
Yeah, yeah. He's learning. So okay, so to wrap this up on a more positive note, let's shake the dust off of our feet a little bit. I want to know what your thoughts about growing things this spring are. Are you doing a garden, or what are your ideas about it?
I'm going back to so the first year that I farmed, I did it with my uncle, and then I did a year where it was like, okay, I'm gonna do partially experimental garden at Pug's Orchard, which is a little orchard that does a garden share where I live. I've written about it at County Highway if anybody's interested in that. And then last year I just did the experimental garden. So this year I think I'm just gonna do with my uncle. I feel like that relationship is really important to me. I think learning directly from him is really important to me. A big
Mm,
part of that is because he learned directly from my grandfather. And I just think like where it's available, having generational ways of learning
yeah.
is good. Mike, who's the owner of Pugs, and Sheila, his wife, have also been really helpful in that regard. And they've been really, really gorgeous people to me. And you know, have in essence been my first friends at home. I don't want to diminish what they're offering in any way, shape, or form, but I just think that you know, having the time with my uncle, I think is really
Yeah.
important.
And what does he like to grow?
Every-
Everything. Okay, so you're gonna continue to learn how to grow everything.
Yeah, so he does the only things that I think that I do different from him is grow. He loves cucumber. I'm like on cucumber. I will do zucchini and I like okra. It doesn't grow as well where I am as it does further south. It
Yeah.
really likes heat, but I try to like literally beat it into submit. Have you grown okra?
I have grown okra. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you heard this?
It grows pretty decently here. I mean, it's probably not, we're, high up in the mountains. It's not as good as
Yeah.
lowlands, but it does pretty well here. Yeah.
Thing of like the old timers saying that like you have to actually beat it with a broomstick.
I haven't heard that.
So I've been told that I would have
Like eat it when it's like just before it's fruited or
no when it's like you know sizable.
yeah.
They say that it likes to be like kind of roughed up, and I thought that they were like pulling my leg. I was like, "There's no way." But then I like saw this old dude in Alabama with a broomstick like beating the hell out of his okra.
Yeah.
I mean, it was growing beautifully, so I'm sold on it.
I wonder who the first person who discovered that was. Like, I'm just gonna beat this okra with a broomstick and see what happens.
I honestly, there have been a couple of seasons because you know it likes the heat and it's hard because your growing season is so short compared to further south that it's like, well, I got to get it in the ground.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't know if this has been the case for you, but early in our season, it's like struggled, and then later in the season, it's picked up and done
Yeah.
okay.
My biggest challenge with okra is harvesting it too late, and then it's already really, like, woody. You have to, like, harvest it at the exact right time.
I know.
No, I tend to, like I think I err now on, like, harvesting it a little bit premature just so I avoid that.
I think
Maybe
that's why.
beating it, like, makes it less woody, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I also not tried this yet, but I'm gonna try it. This old man in Spartanburg, South Carolina, who is from Huntsville, Alabama, told me to try fried okra with sesame oil
Okay.
and you know and
Yeah,
like panko breadcrumbs or whatever. But he was like, you know, try it that way, see what you think about it. And I
yeah,
am so psyched.
yeah. You're
I
gonna
know it's gonna be delicious. I can
yeah.
already tell.
Your mission for the year is to produce the okra that you can then try that way. Nice.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
that's a
but
good
no,
goal.
he grows like he does everything. Like, you know, forest farms ginseng, he keeps bees, he like that, you know, does all the mountain things. But the garden, you know, core of the garden is corn and potatoes. And then he does onions, like green leaf lettuce, summer squash, cucumbers, peas, cabbage, tomatoes, a few different kinds of peppers. He just does it up.
Nice. Well, it seems
Yeah.
like that's a good person to learn from and,
Yeah, he's
future.
also like he's a old regular Baptist preacher, and
Okay.
so usually you get some like really strong theology and like philosophy while you're gardening.
Yeah.
How are you guys feeling about what you got going this year?
I think last year was kind of a flop, partly because hurricane I had, like, 2 big round bales that came from our field that I was gonna use as mulch, and that got washed away with the hurricane, and so I didn't actually mulch anything. or cover it. And so it was so infested with weeds that we only did like maybe a third of what we usually do. And so we did it. We had tomatoes and, a few different things, but I think we just kind of, we were also just so exhausted from like aftermath of the hurricane that we didn't put that much effort into it. So this year, I think we're really raring to go, and we have a lot of plans, and we've bought all of our seeds. So I think we're just gonna probably. I mean, we're definitely narrowing down of like, okay, what do we not like to eat? Like, I love growing sorghum, but we haven't really like been that excited about preparing it and eating it. So I don't know, but it grows so well and it's so pretty. So it's like we got to decide, like, you know, are we gonna like force ourselves this year to like figure out how to prepare it well and eat it. I think we're going to try sweet corn this year instead of field corn, just because it's like doing both is kind of problematic.
Oh,
Sweet corn? You like field corn better?
yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about it. But because doing them together is kind of problematic if they like cross pollinate and
Right.
such. You kind of have to choose one unless you get your timing right. And so yeah, so we're just, I think we're definitely excited about just doing stuff,
Yeah.
work out the details. Lots of
Do
different
y'all
kinds of peppers. We have like 10 different kinds of peppers that we're gonna try. So
do
excited
y'all
about.
do no-till?
We don't have a tiller. We definitely like dig in the soil to like plant stuff and to like, if we need to take out weeds, but we don't till it.
Yeah.
But this it's not like no dig. Like we do disturb the soil a little bit. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean we just it is definitely harder because like we also like no dig is kind of cool because if you put enough mulch on it like compost, then you don't have to worry about as much about weeds. We
Yeah.
don't do that either because I just can't afford to buy, I don't know, 10 yards of compost or whatever. So we're kind of like in this middle zone where it's like maximally difficult in a
Yeah.
way. 'Cause like, tilling is very helpful and, so um
Oh, what you should do on the sorghum, not to boss you, but
it's
there are a couple of dudes. How far away? Do you know how far away you are from Todd?
from Todd.
Yeah.
We're in the same county.
Okay. So Todd, we might have talked about this before, but I'm gonna talk about it again if we did. Todd has a little community center, and the second Friday of every month, they have a square dance there called the
Yeah.
Todd Community
My
Dance.
friend always goes to that and she loves it. She always
I
talks
go,
about it.
I go too. I drive.
No way. You got to tell me when you got to tell me when you guys are going.
Okay, I think we'll
That's
do
like
next.
that's like 25 minutes away from us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're the two guys who are kind of the godfathers of the Todd Community Dance. Both do sorghum molasses. And
Yeah.
they both
I've been to their pressing. So I know who you're talking about, and
yeah.
I've been to they do this day where they press it or a couple days and
Yes.
they play music and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been to
I
one
was
of those.
gonna say, like, just get them out. They'll come.
There we
John,
go. That's true.
the other guy's name is escaping me right now, and I hate that because he's absolutely wonderful. But yeah, I'd say they'll help you out.
They'll take it off my hands.
Yeah.
Yeah, where they grow a lot of it is actually it's in Vilas where they grow a lot of the sorghum, and that's like I don't know 5 or 10 minutes from my house.
I love it.
Could definitely.
I was gonna go to their stir off this year, but they did it the same weekend as my uncle, so I
Okay.
went to my
Well, if you're gonna
uncle's.
go next year, I'll go. I didn't go this last year, but I went the year before. So if you're gonna,
I think John is like an absolute magician when it comes to sort of like proselytizing people about Appalachian culture and bringing them into the
yeah.
culture.
Well, he helps. He teaches at the Appalachian Music Program that Cleo is starting this year.
That's
Cleo's
amazing.
learning guitar. Yeah, and he's a big part of that. So
I love it.
yeah,
That's
he's
so
great.
brilliant.
Yeah,
Yeah, y'all have to come. It's really have you've been to a square dance before?
I actually don't know if I have.
I have.
Have you?
Yeah.
I know I need to go to a square dance. They weren't, I didn't go to them growing up.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
I've
that's
probably been
okay.
too hesitant to go because I don't know what I'm doing,
You
but I should overcome that.
thing that's beautiful about it is that really nobody does.
Yeah.
And even my mom, who grew up doing big circle mountain dance, which is like a variation of square dance. It's like a big circle instead of folks squaring off. And they do some of that at Todd. But even she, both of us have been doing it forever and neither of us have any clue what we're doing. And to me, that's what makes it really beautiful. I think in a way it's aspirational because it's just like how we should be to each other,
Yeah.
society.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you will love it, and the music is wonderful, and, there are a lot of kids that come from App State, um, is that right? Yeah, to go to the dance, uh, and their energy is like it's just like getting a shot of sunshine, honestly, it's so wonderful, so please come.
All right. Well, I will go. You convince me. And definitely let me know if you're gonna go or if you're gonna,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
or this
Yeah,
organization. Yeah.
totally.
Kaleo is whispering in my ear that we need to wrap this up. Uh, now he's playing with the emojis. You can do an emoji, one emoji. Okay, he's doing hearts.
Does mine do that? No.
Well, Farron, this has been great. It's lovely as always to talk to you. I hope to sometime meet you in person, either me going up your way or whenever you're down here.
Totally. I would love it. Thank you so much for taking the time and chatting with me.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too depressing for people, but I think we ended on a good note.
Yeah. I actually, one thing that I will say is before we go is I just want to reiterate that I think that doomerism as a sort of like orientation is not in alignment with the scripture in the sense that we know that things will be difficult on the earth and there's never any question as to that. And I think that the overarching theme that shows up again and again cyclically in scripture is that when you're in the wilderness is the time to depend on God the most. And I do think we're in the wilderness right now, but I also think that we serve a powerful God.
Yeah. Well,
And so that's my pitch for optimism.
yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that if things start getting a lot worse, especially around AI, that there is going to be a religious revival. There
Yeah,
has to be, and that could be transformative. And I hope it happens.
I hope so too.
I mean, it's not in our hands, right? It's God's will and God's plan, and I trust in God. So yeah, I'm not existentially. I'm not so worried because of that.
Amen.
All
Amen.
right. Well, yeah. Amen.